So welcome to the fifth long session where we're wrapping up this overview of the key principles and concepts that inform history pedagogy. So today's topic is interpretation and narrative in history and history education. We're going to start off, as we did with the last couple of weeks, thinking about what the role of interpretation and narrative is in history, and then looking at some practical teaching ideas, and then wrapping up by considering some of the themes from the reading for this week and looking at the task that I've asked you to complete. So the first thing to say is that we need to be aware of the double sense in which we talk about interpretation in history. So on the one hand, we have to interpret sources of information in history by analysing them, comparing them, drawing inferences, etc. And we've talked about this in previous sessions on looking at evidence. But we also construct interpretations of events once we've studied them. And those historical interpretations can also be the subject of study in the history classroom. So sometimes we're looking at individual sources of evidence, and sometimes we're choosing to look at historical accounts as deliberately constructed versions of a period of history or an event or a person. So both require that critical engagement and that active interpretation of what they are and what they mean. But if you think about something like the layers of inference model that you used in a task from a couple of weeks ago, what we put in the middle could either be a photograph of the period of time that we're looking at, or it could be an historian's account of that period of time, and therefore the kind of questions we ask and the kinds of inferences we can draw will be subtly different. So as the very name of the topic, the subject in English, indicates, history is largely about history, and there is an inevitable connection between history and storytelling, or what we might call narrative, the construction of narratives. So is an example really, and it's easier to grasp initially when we think about people's lives. So individual lives are full of contradictions, dead ends, irrationalities, and also things that just don't really have any meaning or purpose. But we give those lives shape, order and direction, and possibly even a strong sense of purpose when we produce a biography. So even in a long biography about an important leader, for example, which might be 500 or 600 pages long, they are bound to have done and said more that is ignored than is included. And in that selection process, in the ordering, in the sequencing, in the relating events in early life to later life, the biographer is imposing a shape and often leading us in a direction of interpreting that life in a particular way. And we do the same when we produce history and historical accounts. So for example, when we produce a story of the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, or the story of the industrialization of the West, we introduce an element of storytelling to give events an order, to choose certain events to be prioritized in our accounts, and then to give the whole set of factors and the whole relationships between them some overarching sense of meaning. So it's important when we're thinking about this to recognise, as Leff does here, that something like the Roman Empire was a series of disconnected experiences for the generations who actually made it up. It's we that give them coherence. It's we that impose the definition of the Roman Empire, and now we come to impose the narrative of the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, so that when we go back and study Roman artefacts or bits of written evidence from Roman life, we are interpreting it and we are locating it in that already established historical narrative. We will start to think about, is this account of a battle an example of the rise or the fall of the empire, and we will interpret it in that context. But the people at the time giving meaning to their actions had no notion of how to frame their lives in such a history, because they were just making sense of it from their own perspective. Another way to look at this is Davies, reflecting on how she writes history, says that I choose to advance my arguments as much by the ordering of narrative, choice of detail, literary voice and metaphor as by topical analysis. So here she's drawing account to the fact that as a historian, once you've looked at your evidence, you've done your analysis, you've created kind of topics and concepts within that, as much of the meaning is written into the history book through stylistic choices, if you like, how you choose to structure and convey a narrative, what you bring to the foreground and focus on as important detail, and what you allow to sit in the background, and the kind of way in which you engage with the reader. So history is important because we create stories in one sense to order all of that information, but we also create stories to convey it with some level of human engagement, to draw the reader into the historical account that we have produced. Now, we as teachers are going about the job of being interpreters as well, and Chris Husbands in his book points out that every time a teacher presents a period of history, that we make a choice about where to start, where to end, what characters and elements of the story to highlight, and what meanings to emphasise. And in doing that, we're constructing stories and we're shaping interpretations. But he also points out that if we want to use history as a school subject to promote critical thinking and to develop a genuine historical understanding of the world, then we also need to be aware of how we do that, and we need to, at least sometimes in our teaching, to offer up alternatives. Now, the extent to which we do this is debated in the literature, and several of the authors that I've referred you to for this course will say that we should do this sparingly. If you only talk about historical interpretations as kind of open terrain for debate, we can sometimes confuse children and give them the impression that history is a subject that doesn't really have a sound footing. So it's important to use these interpretations at times deliberately, but not to do so consistently that we confuse children as to whether we could actually have any form of historical knowledge at all. But Husbands points out that we do need to at least engage with this on occasions, because we want to build children's capacity. Now, he also looks at story and narrative in this in a separate way, really, and he says that we need to remember as history teachers that the story of history is often our greatest asset. So there is a problem if we try to only focus on the academic thinking that lies beneath the surface of the discipline of history, and because we simply lose the power of a good old-fashioned story. So Husband says the stories are our greatest way to motivate, engage and enthuse children about our subject. And he also points out that for children especially, as opposed to adults, stories can help to make abstract and conceptual history more comprehensible because they tend to focus on a more human scale. And I've put a link on the wiki webpage with the links to all of these videos for this week to a Horrible Histories clip, which is taken off as a phenomenon in Britain, but it's worth having a look at, because I think this enables you to see in just a 3 or 4 minute clip how someone who is thinking about how to turn information into little stories, how to relate information to individual people, and how those people therefore really exploit the potential of storytelling in small ways to make information more readily accessible and much more memorable. But the important thing is, when we're thinking about stories in history, is that we're also thinking about how we construct and interpret stories within constraints. This is not purely literary fiction. We're not free writing stories around loosely drawn historical characters. So whilst to some extent we have to craft a story, we do that within some fairly established constraints, and this will help children, if we teach it well, help them resist this idea that because there are interpretations, there's nothing we can really ever know indisputably about history. So the first constraint is that our accounts have to be true to the facts. They have to account for the evidence as we know it. The second is that we have to create accounts which reflect the context, which are true to the historical period that we're writing about. And thirdly, stories should also recognise that there may be other interpretations, and so there's almost a kind of a level of humility which Husband says historians should strike when they're writing their narratives. This awareness that there are other ways to interpret the sources of evidence that we're appealing to. There are other subtly different interpretations and narratives that could be constructed around that evidence base. So we should always be aware that what we're doing is provisional and contestable, rather than writing in a kind of overtly declarative mode that we've established the only true account that could be imagined from analysing the sources. So these are useful for us to remember because they give us a check so that we don't get carried away with the idea that because there are some connections between story writing and history that there are no divisions between those two disciplines. And secondly, I think these could be useful ways for children to check their own and others' accounts for historical veracity, for credibility. Now, Sam Weinberg has also talked about how historians turn the historical research into accounts, and he interviewed a number of academic historians. This is as part of a broader project to explore the division really between school history and academic history. And Weinberg found that these historians almost perceive the work that they produce as a result of their historical investigations as a form of speech. So he puts it like this, that their text emerges as a speech act in the sense that it's a social interaction set down on paper that can be understood only by trying to reconstruct the social context in which they occurred. Readers may slow down, not because they fail to comprehend what the historian has written, but because the very act of comprehension demands they stop and talk with the text. So in a way, the historical account produced by a professional historian, an academic historian, is seen almost as their first go to produce at the beginning of an interaction with people. There is an expectation that we read their account, we wrestle with it, we think about, if they've written it well, we think about, well, is that a correct interpretation of the evidence they've presented to us? Are there other interpretations? Could I see different ways in which you could piece this together? And therefore, what Weinberg is arguing is that we should start to engage with historians' texts, or that we do indeed engage with historians' texts as a kind of written and thought form of speech or dialogue. But obviously then we have to think about, is that a point of difference between academic and school history? Because Weinberg certainly doesn't find that replicated in history classrooms in school or college. So Arthur Chapman has looked at this whole debate and thought about, well, what does it really boil down to for children in the classroom then? And he says there are 4 things we can do without getting too esoteric or lost in the slightly abstracted arguments about what constitutes historical narrative and how we test it. And he says really what we should be aiming for is at the end of secondary school, it would be really useful if children understood that the past has been interpreted in different ways, that they understand how the past has been interpreted differently, that they can begin to explain why the past is interpreted differently, and they can start to evaluate the different interpretations of the past. And so this seems to me 4 useful objectives that we could draw out of this academic debate and pose for school-based history. Understanding that there are differences, understanding how those differences occur, obviously in relation to the purpose of the historian and the kinds of evidence that was available to them to draw on. To think about why, are there different motivations, are there different inquiries, are there different reasons that historians look at this topic, and how do those change in different societies and different times. And then finally thinking about how do we account for those differences, and which ones to us today seem more or less convincing than others. So eventually, after a slightly abstracted conversation, some useful objectives that we could draw out for the learning of history in secondary schools. And in the second part of this lecture, we'll go on and look at some of the very practical ways in which we might try to achieve some of those 4 learning objectives.